Welcome back, and hello if you are new. So thank you ever so much for tuning in, and I hope that you've all had a really lovely week. With extensive support to Slayer on their final campaign world tour, Lamb of God have become more than just a household name. And really with the kind of great bowing out, it did lead to the question of who will be kind of stepping up to the plate. And Lamb of God are very much waiting in the wings. Returning on their 8th album, and their first to not feature one of the founding members that was Chris Adler, the band enter a brand new era on their self-titled effort, Lamb of God. Uncompromising, unflinching, and truly unbelievable, Lamb of God are pretty much responsible for some of the best albums of the last decade. And for the most part, this self-titled record does carry that on. Strangely enough, it's precisely that element of Lamb of God sounding like Lamb of God, which is somewhat of a double-edged sword on this record. The riffs are streamlined to hit their targets perfectly and line up to create those effortless transitions. Bloodshot Eyes, for example, is destined to be a live favourite, and there's so many slick little dynamics. It's also got some really interesting work from Randy Bly, which I think is really cool. It's definitely, for me, his best performance on the album and probably the most varied. Yet as much as the songwriting may be slick, for me there just aren't that many fuck yeah kind of moments on this album, and that's always been a really kind of big point of Lamb of God's sound. Josh Wilbur's production may well allow for every instrument to be heard, but I also think that it does flatten the impact of some of the arrival of the craziest moments on the album. A prime example of this is Reality Bath and Resurrection Man. And there's a lot of build up for sure, and it keeps that sort of tension going, but then it just kind of peters out a little bit and doesn't have that sort of gut punch that you normally get with a Lamb of God track. Technicality has always been something that the band have had in their arsenal, and a big selling point for me to really enjoy the band personally. And on this album it seems that things have been slightly watered down. Not necessarily completely gone, but just watered down. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just different. And there are some riffs which I do feel like were recycled a little bit. For example, Resurrection Man sounds very similar to Murta. And there's the ending of On the Hook, which is kind of a little bit lackluster, but on the whole, the songs themselves kind of save it, and it doesn't kind of focus too much on one negative aspect. But as I said, this isn't necessarily saying that everything has gone from Lamb of God. Poison Dream is a great example, which has that sort of Ashes of the Wake, 11th hour kind of feel to it. New Colossal Hate is another example of their brilliant songwriting as well, and has that sort of aggressive tendency that can be seen in Lamb of God's discography. Once you accept that this album isn't necessarily going to be as crazy as the likes of Ashes, Palaces or Sacrament, it kind of gets its claws into you. I think that the self-titled album is quite an accessible record, and there's also, little things that they've added in, for example, guest vocals. I know they've had guest vocals in the past, but there's Chuck Billy's appearance on Roots. And then on Poison Dream there's Jamie Jasta, which is interesting, but for me I think Jasta kind of derails the song a little bit. It's also worth mentioning that Art Cruz definitely holds his own. There are some cool tricks that he does on the kit that proves that he can definitely hang with the big leagues. On New Colossal Hate, for example, and Poison Dream, there's really interesting stuff, and then there's a bit of an experimental blast beat section on the Hook, which I thought was really cool. So it is incredibly slick and well put together, but at the same time it is somewhat formulaic, which for me kind of stops it from, reaching those higher scores. It's an album that will work brilliantly in a live setting, and really when you think about that this is going to be, the potential to conquer Slayer and, reach those kind of heights, it's a good album, for sure. This is Lamb of God at their most typical, slinging riffs and earth-shattering choruses aplenty. But it's that individualistic nature of the band that's been somewhat stunted. So I only hope that on the next album, maybe there's a little bit more of that explored. But overall, it's a very solid album. So thank you ever so much for watching this album review. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned a little bit more about Lamb of God and their brand new album. If you did, it would be really cool if you could like and subscribe. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter. You can follow me at The Metal Tris and we can have a chat. Make sure to drop a comment and I will see you guys next week for another album review. Take care, my friends.